this video, our group will be presenting about accounting financial instrument and distinguishing between equity and liability, that based on article that titled Expansion Fund Investment, Impact of the Liability Structure or Equity Allocation by Tim Barker.
Financial liability represents what an entity owes to other parties. Similar to asset, the liability component can also be divided into two categories, which is financial liability and non-financial liability. Paragraph 11 of MFRS 132 provides a definition for financial liability, which is generally summarized as a contractual obligation for an entity to deliver cash or exchange financial asset. According to the provision contained in paragraph 4.2.1 of the MFRS 9, financial liability is generally classified as either fair value at profit or loss or amortized. From the technical perspective, liability represents a present obligation to transfer an economic resource as a result of past event. The conceptual framework for financial reporting stipulates three criteria of characteristic for a liability to exist, which are an entity has an obligation such that the entity has no practical ability to avoid such obligation. Next, the obligation is to transfer an economic resource such as to pay cash, to deliver goods or services, or to others. Then, the obligation is a present obligation that exists as a result of past event. A liability that does not meet the above definition is classified as non-financial liability. Financial liabilities are recognized in the financial statements when and only when the entity becomes a party to the contractual provision of the instrument. On its initial recognition, financial liabilities are measured at their fair value minus transaction costs that are directly attributable to the financial liabilities. Equity is defined as a residual interest in the asset of the entity after deducting all its liability. Apart from debt instrument, an entity could also resort to equity instrument for financing its business operation. For an equity instrument, the entity which issued the instrument is not required to repay the amount, unlike the financial liability. Equity claims in an entity depends on the contractual right conferred to each of the class of equity instrument issued. In some entities, different equity holders of the company have different rights to the claim of residual interest in the company. For example, a different class of shares, such as common shares and preference shares, give their holders different right to the dividends or claims on the residual interest of the company on liquidation. The accounting for equity instrument is governed under MFRS 132. Similar to financial liabilities, an equity instrument is recognized when the entity becomes the party to the contractual provisions of the instrument. There is an example of characteristic of financial equity. First, equity finance is the permanent capital of the company which has not maturity period. Equity shareholders are entitled for dividends after paying dividend to preference shareholders. If the company wound up, the equity shareholders have the right to get the claims on asset. They are the real owner of the company and have control over the management and related decision. Equity shareholders has only limited liability to the value of share they have purchased. Company is not obligated to pay dividends mandatory.
Distinguish between liability and equity. As Black 1895, the liability structure is directly related to the pension liability, which is essentially the present value for all benefit to be paid. Black also already distinguished between two views of the liability, a narrow view and a broad view. The narrow liability is the present value of vested benefit for the current workforce. It is the equivalent liability that will exist if all current employees will quit and not replaced. The narrow liability also take into account and the liability of the already retired workforce. To value this liability, Black compared it to a security that pay dividend or interest. Each time benefit are paid, the value of the liability decrease by the same amount like stock do on X dividend dates. Funding or hedging the narrow liability is similar of the risk of near-term shortfall where an asset is needed that is relatively certain to produce a certain return of a specific time frame rather than unpredictable return in the long term. The other view on the liability that Black suggests is the broad liability. In contrast to the narrow liability, it is the present value for all benefit to be paid by the plan. It is always greater than the narrow liability and the equivalent to what a claim for all benefit will sell for in the open market. In addition to the narrow liability, it includes, according to Black, salary increase, all benefit to be accrued in the future, changes in benefit, retirement, debt and addition to the workforce. Different to the narrow liability, it can only be based on expectation to value the broad liability on needs to estimate, for example, the effect of salary inflation and addition to the workforce in the future. Black described this is similar to the behavior of a security again, where the market also based the price on the best estimate of future cash flow. For liability Peskin 1997, Peskin distinguished between liability that look like bond and look less like bond. The comparison to bond is meant to highlight the characteristic of the benefit payment in fund, which are either relatively fixed and predictable like bond or the opposite. For example, a liability of already retired employee is meant to look almost like bond payment. For June 2000, June addressed the same concept with the Peskin and add that when the liability look less like bond, they can be seen more like a continuous payment stream. For Blake 1989 equity, the broad liability is, according to Blake, subject to a large set of development like salary increase, retirement, debt and addition to the workforce. Obviously, an asset that develops similar to such a liability is likely to be subject to the same development. Black therefore focused on the relationship between stock return and salary increase. Black also argued that stock return have track compensation ground over the long term and thus stock or equity should mostly be used to fund the broad liability. In conclusion, previous research have found evidence that equity returns track wage inflation over the long term. This relationship is usually due to the general economic condition which underlay equity and wage inflation. Thus, equities tend to surge when economic conditions are good and wages are increasing. Based on this argument, it hypothesis. For the Pekin 1997 also argue for the vital role of equity to fund the liability. However, he drew back on the importance of distinguishing between liabilities depending on how much they look like bonds. Therefore, he suggests to use equity for liabilities that look less like bonds. Such a liability shows a great deal of noise, as measured by the volatility of the relationship between bonds and pension liability. Also, Peskin adds that the growth in workforce is an important determinant of equity exposure. For the Chan 2000, also acknowledged that when liability are taken to be ongoing payment stream, that a bond portfolio can contain a great deal of risk. In such a situation, he suggests that the lowest risk portfolio as measured by the lowest future contribution cost. It constructed mainly by assets which relate mostly with the actual wages inflation and not necessarily real inflation, because pension liability are mainly determined by increase in wages and not the price of goods and service. Thus, he concluded by arguing that pension plans can reduce their cost in the long term by including equities and real estate because their high sensitivity to changes in wage level and employment opportunities.
The problems arise related to the issue discussed in this article is the effects of wages inflation, workforce growth, and return on liabilities on the equity allocation of pension fund. In clear statement, this fact is about if pension funds with growing liability that are due to workforce increase and wages inflation such as in a growing firm have a higher risk exposure than pension funds with a more stable and more matured liability. This problem has already issued by author Alex Talo, Peskin, and Body. The main argument is that pension funds always have to take into account their liabilities and cannot just focus on maximizing the return by applying traditional efficient frontier methods of asset allocation. Alex Talo mainly argued that pension assets need to match pension liabilities both in terms of funding ratio and the correlation of the asset with the liability it funds. This reflects the idea of the asset liability management study which is often conducted in pension, banking, insurance and most other finance settings. Next problem is in the future, the liability will be much larger than today. Thus, it is the fund's responsibility to invest accordingly already today and save the plan sponsor money in the form of reduced future contributions. On the other hand, Body agrees that using higher risk and higher return assets in order to reduce future contributions has an adverse effect on shareholder wealth of the sponsoring company. Plan sponsor should aim for an immunization strategy for pension liabilities and reduce volatility to increase the value to the plan sponsor company's shareholder. The role of equity as an asset in the relationship with the liability structure is a widely researched subject. The key concept to understand the role of equity in asset liability management is mentioned by Peskin, who argues that if there will be an asset that will behave identically to the pension liability it funds, there will be no need for future contributions anymore. Equity exposure of a pension fund is to a great deal influencing its future contribution costs, since a duration match can be used to design an asset that behaves identically in a bond portfolio. When the liability is fixed in terms of future benefit payments, most of the focus in the literature lies on accomplishing a similar method for liabilities that are more uncertain. Otto Black also agree that stock returns have trade compensation growth over the long term, and those stock or equity should mostly be used to fund the broad liability. Interest income from cash nor treasury bill returns could keep up with the inflations and productivity change that drive compensation growth.
Approaches might be used by the standard setter for this issue. In order to solve these cases, one approach has been used by the standard setter to make the measurement of asset allocation comparable to the theories discussed in the article. The actual asset allocation as independent variable. This is because only the equity exposure is used to describe asset allocation. Also, a simple multivariate regression model is used to study the relationship. The regression model will test a linear relationship between the variable related to the hypothesis together with the control variable with the actual equity exposure of pension fund available in the sample. By using this method, three variables are constructed. The first hypothesis states that the wage inflation is related to the equity exposure of a fund. Since the actual wage inflation cannot directly be observed for an individual pension fund, it is indirectly measured as the indexation offered by a fund to offset the impact of wage inflation. The second hypothesis states that the growth in the workforce covered by the pension plan is related to the equity exposure. According to Peskin, the growth in the workforce for an individual pension plan is measured in percentage as the year-over-year increase or decrease in its active participant. Active members are generally current employees of the sponsor company and thus a good measure of a workforce growth on the level of individual fund. For the third hypothesis, the relationship between the growth in pension liability and equity exposure is measured. Identical to the research of Chan on pension liabilities, the average annual rate of return on liability for a fund is used as a measurement. The annual rate is calculated by taking the average of annual changes in per capita PBO.
In a nutshell, the article tells us about the wage inflation through times, workforce growth, and return on liabilities on the equity allocation of Dutch pension funds. A predicted positive impact of wage inflation are not represented in higher actual or strategic equity allocation, where can be seen through argument of Black 1989 and Arnold and Bernstein 1988, where by investing more in equity, it could be a barrier against rising wages. Then, a positive relationship between weighted and unweighted model in the robustness show with strategic equity allocation, it will make larger fund as it have more resources to monitor the development of the workforce. Furthermore, the theory by Chun 2000 suggests that pension plan with high return on liabilities need more equity allocation, as the need of high equity return as it can be used for pension liabilities. So, in the article, it suggests that variety of allocation on equity should be used in wage inflation two times, workforce growth, and return on liabilities on the equity allocation.